Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to a riveting Q&A session after this presentation. I'll try to keep this as short as I can, but there's so much information, especially compared to last year's press conference. Earth is in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. This graphic shows 11 different outcomes associated with abrupt, irreversible climate change. Across the top, higher temperatures, wilder weather, less snowpack, shrinking sea ice, and increased ocean acidification. Half a dozen more on the bottom half of the graphic, plus more fires, more volcanic activity, and more earthquakes. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the go-to source for people who are taking a very conservative approach, because the IPCC is a very conservative scientific organization as well as a political organization, even the IPCC has admitted that we are in the midst of abrupt climate change. In their Global Warming of 1.5 degrees report from October 8, 2018, the IPCC includes these words, quote, "These global events of human-driven change far exceed the rates of change driven by geophysical or biosphere forces that have altered the Earth's system trajectory in the past," and they refer to 2 peer-reviewed papers in reaching that conclusion. Even abrupt geophysical events do not approach rates of human-driven change. In other words, this is the most abrupt example of climate change in planetary history that we know about so far. In a separate report, this one coming out September 24th, 2019, the IPCC concluded that, quote, "Ocean acidification and deoxygenation, ice sheet and glacier mass loss, and permafrost degradation are expected to be irreversible on timescales relevant to human societies and ecosystems." This according to 5 peer-reviewed papers quoted by the IPCC in their special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. In other words, Earth is in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change, as expected and predicted long ago. Take, for example, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, the precursor organization to the IPCC, and in the last year of its existence, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases reported in October 1985, quote, "Beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage." End quote. Could and have. That's what was expected at 1 degree C above the 1750 baseline. Science writer and speaker with a focus on climate change, David Spratt, reported in October 2014 in a presentation called "Dangerous Climate Change, Myths and Realities." Spratt indicated at that time that self-reinforcing feedback loops had been triggered already at 0.5 C, above the 1750 baseline. So, consistent with what was predicted by the precursor to the IPCC, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, we have already triggered abrupt, irreversible climate change, in fact, long ago. I've reported on dozens of these self-reinforcing feedback loops at Nature Bats Last, which you can find at KaiMcPherson.com, most notably in the climate change summary. In addition, I've reported on these self-reinforcing feedback loops in my 2021 paper in Academia Letters, Rapid Loss of Habitat for Homo sapiens, as well as in my other recent peer-reviewed paper, this one from this year, 2022, in Results in Engineering, which is part of the esteemed Elsevier series of journals. Of course, we're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change, as has been expected for a long time. In addition, we have exceeded the 2C threshold that many refer to as being critically important. Mind you, we trigger these self-reinforcing feedback loops, and therefore it made climate change abrupt and irreversible at 0.5 degree C above the 1750 baseline. But here we are, years later, with Andrew Glikson, the esteemed Australian professor, reporting in his October 8th, 2020 book, The Event Horizon, quote, "During the Anthropocene, greenhouse gas forcing has risen by more than 2.0 watts per meter squared, equivalent to more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures, which constitutes an abrupt event over a period not much longer than a lifetime, end quote. In other words, in a very short period of time, we have increased the global average temperature above the 2 degrees C mark, which is the disaster threshold still identified as lying in the future by the very conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In addition, that rapid increase in global average temperature is responsible for a mass extinction event that has been underway, according to the father of diversity, Edward O. Wilson, since at least 1992. In other words, for some 30 years, we have known that we are in the midst of a mass extinction event. I'll quote from page 32 of E.O. Wilson's 1992 book, The Diversity of Life. Quote, "Humanity has initiated the sixth great extinction spasm, rushing to eternity a large fraction of our fellow species in a single generation." End quote. That's from page 32 of this book, published in 1992 and written well before then. E.O. Wilson reports again this same notion, the mass extinction event being underway, in his 2002 book, The Future of Life. In fact, it's that global average increase in temperature as a result of human activities that underlies the ongoing mass extinction event, finally reported by the United Nations Environment Program in August of 2010, and also reported finally in the peer-reviewed literature on March 2nd, 2011, years after E.O. Wilson has reported it, years after we were warned in 1985 that the increase in global average temperature would drive this sort of event. Barnowski and 11 other scholars reported in the esteemed Nature series with a paper, "Has the Earth's sixth mass extinction already arrived?" They reported, yes, it has. And there's a lot of back and forth in the peer-reviewed literature in the following 11 years. But the final nail was driven into the coffin with respect to this issue with a paper by Cowie and colleagues published on January 10th, 2022 in Biological Reviews, entitled "The Sixth Mass Extinction, Fact, Fiction, or Speculation?" And they confirm that in fact, it's fact. The sixth mass extinction is underway. Actually, it's at least the 8th mass extinction event, but I won't get into those details here. Very recently, in fact, in a paper published November 30th, 2021 in Scientific American, Dr. Henry G., paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and senior editor at Nature, the esteemed Nature series of journals, writes, quote, "If we are going to write about human extinction, we'd better start writing now." End quote. That's his closing line in this paper, because he is indicating that the abrupt climate change we are experiencing is leading to a very abrupt mass extinction event, worse, as reported in the peer-reviewed literature, than any previous mass extinction event. And this should be no surprise. In addition, it should be no surprise that this has affected and will continue to affect Homo sapiens, our favorite species. The rate of change projected by the IPCC, which of course is very slow, outstrips the ability of vertebrates to adapt by 10,000 times. This according to a peer-reviewed paper by Quintero and Weens, published in Ecology Letters, June 26th, 2013. So we have known that the rate of change projected by the IPCC, the very slow rate of change projected by the IPCC, outstrips the ability of vertebrates to adapt by a factor of 10,000 times. It gets worse. Mammals cannot keep up either. This according to a peer-reviewed paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, published October 15th, 2018 by Davis and colleagues. In fact, again in the esteemed Nature series, this paper from January 9th, 2020 by Davis and colleagues, tardigrades almost certainly will not survive. Tardigrades are the go-to species and genus for people who claim that there will still be life in the wake of this mass extinction event. According to this peer-reviewed paper in the esteemed, again, Nature series and Scientific Reports, even tardigrades will not keep up. with the ongoing rate of change. And this is no great surprise when you look at other peer-reviewed literature, such as the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, published November 13th, 2018, again in Scientific Reports, an incredibly high-ranked journal, entitled Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life During Extreme Environmental Change. And the extreme environmental change referred to here is 5 or 6 degrees C above the 1750 baseline. They report that there is still some chance. In the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, we find this quote: "A rogue, seemingly desert Earth wandering across the universe could still have some tiny chance of blooming again under some lucky and unlikely circumstances." That's the line from Strona and Bradshaw. That's the chance we have of life persisting on Earth in the wake of this very rapid mass extinction event that is ongoing today. It gets worse, of course. Going back a few years, before the paper by Strona and Bradshaw, we see a paper posted by Gerardo Ceballos and colleagues in Science Advances on June 19th, 2015. And upon release of that paper, in an interview, Ceballos said, quote, "Life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on," end quote. So it's a little surprising to me that we're still here some 7 years later, after this mass extinction event was expected to terminate life for Homo sapiens. As complex organisms relying upon many other organisms for our own survival, it's astonishing to me that we're still here. What does this mean for the future? That abrupt, irreversible climate change underlies the ongoing, very rapid mass extinction event? Well, according to Burke and colleagues in the esteemed Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in a paper December 10th, 2018, which notably relies upon the IPCC's representative concentration pathways, quote, "Climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030 CE, for current era, and persist under climate stabilization scenarios," end quote. The IPCC's representative concentration pathways ignore self-reinforcing feedback loops, dozens of them, and the loss of aerosol masking, or the aerosol masking effect, so that we can use the representative concentration pathways and still reach the conclusion that we're headed for Pliocene-style climates as early as 2030 is astonishing. That's a stunningly rapid rate of change, far faster than anything we have experienced so far, even though we have warmed the planet very rapidly. It gets worse, of course. In a paper in Nature published April 8th, 2020, and again relying upon the IPCC's representative concentration pathways, Trizos and colleagues conclude, quote, "We project that future disruption of ecological assemblages as a result of climate change will be abrupt because within any given ecological assemblage, the exposure of most species to climate conditions beyond their realized niche limits occurs almost simultaneously. Such abrupt exposure events begin before 2030, end quote." So this paper suggests that during the decade of the 2020s, the oceans will begin dying. We're in the midst of a marine heating event that is warming the planet, in addition to terrestrial surfaces being warmed. And the paper by Trizos and colleagues, relying again upon the representative concentration pathways, takes this very conservative approach and indicates that during the current decade, we will warm the oceans to such a high degree that the oceans and life in the oceans will begin dying. Okay, that's all terrible news. So how do we respond? This figure shows one route. We all have our to-do lists. They might be personal, they might involve family members, they might involve friends, but we have these to-do lists. And we also have an awareness of death. Those of us, at least who are paying attention, have known since we were, 10 or 12 years old that we would die. So what do we do with this awareness of death? And in addition, our list of things to do. What matters most, as indicated by this figure, is the intersection between those two elements, between those two factors. So let's try to focus on those things in the short time we have remaining. I'll use a couple of cartoons to again point out the kinds of things we might focus on during our remaining time on Earth. The upper left panel has the line, "I should have bought more crap." It's obviously an old man who's on his deathbed, and this is the response of essentially nobody as they're on their deathbed. I should have bought more crap. No, most of us regret other things in our lives, things we didn't do, things we didn't say, not the things that we should have bought, especially more crap. What most of us do, as shown in this lower right cartoon, is use the expectations of others as the bars to build our own cages. This is a wonderful graphic that indicates that the expectations of others should not be the basis for how we conduct our daily lives. We all do this, of course. That's one of the elements of this culture in which we are embedded, is that we rely upon the expectations of others to go about our daily activities. So then, why are we here? I turn to Kurt Vonnegut, famous American writer, for his thoughts on what we should do, on why we are here. Quoting his son Mark, Kurt Vonnegut says, "We are here to help each other through this, whatever this is." And that sounds like a great idea to me. Kurt Vonnegut's son Mark went from living in a home for people deemed mentally unwell to Harvard University, where he graduated from medical school. So he's been through some challenging times, obviously. And then Kurt Vonnegut quotes his uncle in saying, quote, "We are here to fart around and don't let anybody tell you any different," end quote. So let's look at the intersection between those two things. We are here to help each other through this, whatever this is, and we're here to fart around. We're actually here to have fun. The intersection of those two might provide some advice as we near the end of our time, the end of habitat for our species and therefore all life on Earth. Now that's why we are here. That addresses the issue, what are we doing here anyway? What about you? What about me? Why am I here? Try to turn the question on yourself instead of on the collective. I am here because I'm a teacher. That's who I am. It's not merely what I do. I am a teacher. That's what defines me. Here I give some examples. The upper left panel shows me with a former student named Mary. We met some 18 years after she took my class in conservation biology at the University of Arizona. We met in Florida, where she was living at the time. And through many moves, marriage, disruption of family, all kinds of activity going on in her life, Mary kept the assignment that I gave to that class in conservation biology those many years ago. She brought it with her when we were going to meet at the beach for a couple of hours. Turning then to the lower left panel, I show a picture here from the New Trading Cafe in Olympia, Washington, where for about 5 years I was delivering public presentations at no cost to the attendees of the presentation, and therefore for no income on my behalf. So I was presenting on tour here, and that led to one of the participants in this presentation deciding to serve as my booking agent, voluntarily on her part and voluntarily on mine, so that I could go on tour and be well enough organized that I would reach many people. And in fact, as a result of her efforts, I reached many thousands of additional people and didn't have to worry about the myriad details associated with putting together a speaking tour. More recently, since a coordinated defamation campaign has effectively removed me from public service, I offer, along with my partner Pauline, right now behind the camera, the Only Love Remains workshop, which over a span of a couple of days goes deep into how we might address the future of our relatively short lives. What are we going to do? What am I going to do in light of the short future I have in front of me? So that's the point of this workshop, which is one of the ways I have to reach people, including presentations like this one. As I already indicated, Earth is losing habitat for human animals, even as we speak. In fact, this paper by Colin Raymond and colleagues in the esteemed Science Advances series indicates that Earth is losing habitat for human animals. And upon release of the paper, during an interview, lead author Colin Raymond said, quote, "Previous studies projected that this would happen several decades from now, but this shows it's happening right now," end quote. And what he's talking about is the emergence of heat and humidity too severe for human tolerance, as indicated by the title of the paper. What that means is the combination of heat and high humidity leads to organ failure and therefore lethal wet bulb temperatures beyond the ability of human beings to adapt. It's worse than that, of course. Earth is losing habitat for human animals even faster than expected. A couple of years after that previous paper by Raymond and colleagues came out, we have this paper in the Journal of Applied Physiology, again a peer-reviewed paper, indicating that the 35 degrees C wet bulb temperature is way too high. In fact, here's a quote from the paper itself. "We find that uncompensable heat stress in humid environments occurs in young, healthy adults at wet bulb temperatures significantly lower than 35 degrees C. In other words, 35 degrees C, which we've long believed to represent the limit at which human beings begin to lose their organs and therefore to die as a result of lost habitat, that number is way too high. In fact, a much lower wet bulb temperature than 35 degrees C is responsible for human deaths as a result of organ failure. So Earth is losing habitat for human animals even faster than expected a couple of years ago. This brings me to the idea of the exponential function, which I will demonstrate here with a short video. The exponential function is something with which we are poorly adapted to carry out. Natural selection as a result of evolution has led us to the idea that we will persist for a long time, and very rapid rates of environmental change are beyond our ability to adapt. So here's the short video.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
That's the exponential function. Now what? Now what do we do as a society and as individuals? As Edward Abbey, the Southwestern American writer, pointed out, if the situation is hopeless, there's nothing to worry about. And it appears to me that the situation is hopeless. If the extremely conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concludes that we're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change, proceeding much faster than previous events in planetary history, then I'd say we're in real trouble and the situation is hopeless. As a consequence, there's nothing to worry about. Edward Abbey also pointed out that action is the antidote to despair. If you are inclined to despair, then taking action seems like a great idea. There are many actions any of us can take in light of abrupt, irreversible climate change leading to the ongoing mass extinction event. I'll give a couple of examples. First, though, a few words about Stephen Jenkinson, who spent almost his entire adult life in what he calls the death trade. Quote, "The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed." End quote. And I agree, and that's why we offer the Only Love Remains workshop, initially based on a grief recovery workshop offered by the Grief Recovery Institute. I turn here to a definition of hope from the Merriam-Webster online dictionary. Hope is to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen or be true. I want a lot of things to happen. I want a lot of things to be true, but that doesn't make them happen. Action is the antidote to despair, as Edward Abbey pointed out many years ago. Hoping something will happen, wishing that something will happen, is not the way to make it happen. As the Grief Recovery Institute points out in their definition of grief, grief is wishing for a different past. We can no more wish for a different past than we can wish for a certain future. Wishing for a different past is the quickest way to despair that I know about. What I do propose is planetary hospice. I do not propose giving up, whatever that means, in light of ongoing, abrupt, and irreversible climate change. Instead, I suggest planetary hospice. At the personal level, this involves treating everyone as you would treat your beloved elderly grandmother. You know that this woman has had a long life and it's drawing near its end. How are you going to act to this wonderful person that has treated you well throughout your life? I would hope you would act with love. At the community level, increasing our interactions a bit, at the community level, we can address racism, misogyny, homelessness, and other community level challenges. All of these challenges are going on in essentially every town and visit I've ever known about. Every town and community and city that I've ever lived in or visited has been characterized by racism, misogyny, homelessness, and various other community level events that none of us are proud of. Let's address those. Let's go to the city council. Let's try to fix the things we can in the time that we have left. At the societal level, we must immediately decommission nuclear power plants. Why? Not because increased nuclear activity will produce some sort of nuclear winter. It won't. Instead, as pointed out by a peer-reviewed paper in the Nature series, the Toba supervolcano eruption caused severe tropical stratospheric ozone depletion. What are the consequences of that stratospheric ozone depletion? That accelerates planetary overheating beyond the point at which it's happening already. If you've seen the 2021 film starring Tom Hanks called Finch, you'll know what I'm talking about. Once the nuclear power plants melt down, we lose stratospheric ozone, which protects us from the sun's very bright rays. Unlike as was shown in that film, Finch, the sun burning does not begin within a few seconds, but it does begin in a few minutes. That's very, very rapid heating that will lead to loss of habitat for our species and others in a very short period of time. If we want to preserve any life on Earth, then we must immediately begin the process of decommissioning nuclear facilities. That will be challenging because all the money and all the governments in the world are pointed the other direction. Just because it's challenging doesn't mean we shouldn't avoid the task. Back to the question, what should we do? What is worth doing? For any of us, indeed, what shall we do? What is worth doing? As Kurt Vonnegut pointed out in one of his last commencement addresses on a college campus, quote, "Join the National Guard or the Marines and teach democracy." I'm kidding. Obviously, he was kidding. He goes on, quote, "We are about to be attacked by Al-Qaeda. Wave flags if you have them. That always seems to scare them away." And then he goes on, "I'm kidding." Of course he's kidding. He knew that war was the go-to answer for politicians to transfer money and bodies from the poor to the wealthy. Instead, when he got serious, Kurt Vonnegut said at this graduation address, quote, "Go into the arts. I'm not kidding. The arts are not a way to make a living. They are a very human way of making life more bearable. Practicing an art, no matter how well or badly, is a way to make your soul grow, for heaven's sake." Not bad from an atheist. Sing in the shower, dance to the radio, tell stories, write a poem to a friend, even a lousy poem. Do it as well as you possibly can. You will get an enormous reward. You will have created something. End quote. Is there a better reward than that? If so, I can't imagine what it is. After all, any moment may be our last. As pointed out by Homer in the Iliad nearly 2,800 years ago, any moment might be our last. That's a direct quote. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. End quote. In the previous paragraph, Homer was pointing out that this is why the gods envy us. Because we are doomed. Because we have a short, finite life. What shall I do? What shall you do as an individual? What is worth doing? That's how I started. That's how I want to finish. I will point to a quote frequently attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson, but not found anything he has said or written. Quote, "The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well." End quote. I think those are great words, whoever came up with them. I'll finish with my own combination, if you will, of Kurt Vonnegut and Ralph Waldo Emerson, of people who have given advice about how to live and live well. They have influenced me. They and many others have influenced me. And I frequently include words such as these at presentations I give or during interviews. I'm asked nearly every day for advice about living. I recommend living where you feel most alive and simultaneously where you feel most useful. I recommend living fully. I recommend living with intention. I recommend living urgently, with death in mind. I recommend the pursuit of excellence. I recommend the pursuit of love. In light of the short time remaining in your life, and my own, I recommend all of the above, louder than before, more fully than you can imagine, to the limits of this restrictive culture, and beyond. For you, for me, for us, for here, for now. Live large, be you, and bolder than you've ever been. Live as though you're dying. The day draws near. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to interact with you today. I look forward to a robust Q&A session beginning right now.